It's Friday, October 22nd, 2021. My name is Ashton Ellett, here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies at the University of Georgia. I'm here today with Kyle Hayes. He's the co-founder and co-host of Peach Pod, a Georgia politics podcast. He can also be heard on Political Rewind with Bill Nigut, a Georgia Public Broadcasting political podcast, where he is a regular contributor. Kyle earned his bachelor's degree in political science and social studies secondary education from the University of Georgia and a master's in public policy analysis from American University in Washington, D.C. He is a research associate at the Washington, D.C.-based Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where he focuses on healthcare and immigration issues. Kyle, welcome back to Athens. Good to have you, and thanks for taking some time this afternoon to talk history and politics with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So let's go ahead and start. Tell me a little bit about your childhood and upbringing. You grew up in Woodstock, right?
I did. So yeah, I grew up in Woodstock, kind of in between Woodstock and Ackworth, which is in Metro Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And it was a great place to grow up. You have Lake Allatoona there. There were lots of fun things to do when I was a kid. And then because you have the proximity to Atlanta, I think that was something that piqued my early interest in, potentially moving to a bigger city, mm-hmm. which I would later do when I went to Washington for grad school. But yeah, it was a great place to grow up. The funny thing is, if you knew me as a kid or as a young person into high school, you might not have thought I would have ended up caring about politics. I wasn't a particularly good student. I wasn't a particularly motivated student. But I had a teacher named Anna Pettit at Etowah High School in Cherokee County, who was both my American government teacher and my U.S. history teacher, who really, I think, early on piqued an interest for me in politics and in history. And then through friends that I had, through experiences here at the University of Georgia in the political science program, I really developed that interest in politics, and particularly politics in our state here in Georgia. And then, later on in my work, found an interest in public policy, which drew me to Washington.
Right. So you actually went to Kennesaw State first before transferring to UGA?
I did, yeah, and it's sort of a interesting lens into the way in which higher education policy landed for me early in my life. So my senior year at Etowah High School, I actually did the dual enrollment program at Kennesaw State. And then the dual enrollment program and sort of the different environment, I think, actually allowed me to get my grades back up to a level where I was eligible for the Hope Scholarship.
I see.
And then that's what actually allowed me to, I did my first year of undergrad at Kennesaw State, and then from there transferred to the University of Georgia. And I was able to because of the Hope Scholarship. I wouldn't have been able to afford it otherwise. And so yeah, Kennesaw was a great school. It was a great starting point. But in terms of both the college environment that I wanted and then the opportunities that I had in the political science program, UGA was just a great place to land.
So you also majored in social studies education. Were you planning to be a high school teacher, or was that the original plan?
Yeah, that was kind of the original plan. I liked political science just as sort of like a passion or an interest of mine, but at the time I really didn't know what I could do with that degree. Mm-hmm. And when I was in undergrad, I was working in retail. I was working at public supermarkets here in Athens, and so I wasn't spending a lot of time at the Young Democrats meetings here at UGA or participating in a lot of like campaigns or things like that. In undergrad, I was just going to class and going to work. And so the social studies education thing was kind of, well, I don't know what I'll do with a political science degree, but I think I would like to be a teacher, and I know that's something that I could do. But the fact that those two kind of meshed together actually led in some ways to my interest in public policy, because one of the things I was interested in the teaching profession, was of course learning how to become a teacher, learning how to do those sorts of things, but also all of the policies that go into it and the ways in which teachers are evaluated, how that impacts their career paths, how that impacts who wants to go in and actually become a teacher. And so, that was some of my first exposure really to public policy, just in terms of the policies that teachers had to deal with just in their everyday jobs.
As the spouse of a first grade teacher, I too have a side interest in those policies as well. So Tell me, you mentioned working and going to class and studying to be a teacher. When did you actually get involved in campaigns and elections?
So it actually mostly occurred after graduation.
Okay.
After I graduated, I looked for a teaching job. I was kind of ready to get out of retail, but this is in 2012. We're just kind of 2 or 3 years removed.
Not a
from
great
the
time to be
recession.
looking. No.
Yeah, it was a tough time to find teaching jobs, and I was sort of the older person in my friend group, so I wanted to spend at least one more year in Athens because most of my friends were still in college here. And so I was like, I would love to teach in Clark County or maybe Oconee County or Barrow County, one of the counties here in the Athens area, but there just weren't a lot of openings.
Sure.
So I ended up in a different job that I didn't really like very much, and I was on a lunch break at that job one day, and I found out that Spencer Fry, who's here in Athens, was running for state representative. This was after the primary. This was sort of I would say this was maybe August or September of 2012, so like the general election is really just heating up. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't know who Spencer is, but this would be something fun to do, and maybe this would actually be an opportunity for me to use some of what I learned in political science and in social studies education. And so, he had kind of an open house for potential campaign volunteers, and I just kind of showed up randomly one time, gave them my information, told them about my background, and then pretty quickly was engaged in helping get that, or helping move that general election campaign forward, doing door knocking and organizing data, things like that. But then Spencer actually approached me about my interest in public policy when he had a questionnaire about his views on education policy that he had to fill out. And he knew that was my background and my interest, and so he asked me to sort of take the first crack at it, tell him what I thought about these issues, coming out of my education program at Georgia and my thoughts as a young person, probably a way too young person, to be having really strong opinions about the best policies for teachers in Georgia. But it was sort of the first opportunity that I had to actually put that public policy interest to work.
So is that when you began thinking of this being public policy as your real career path, is with the Fry internship?
Yeah, that was when I started to wonder, how could I actually turn this into a career? And so moving forward, Spencer Fry wins that election. He becomes the state representative for House District 118 here in Athens. And this is the first time he'd been elected to the state house.
Right.
For everyone involved in the campaign, none of us had legislative experience or experience at the state house. And so we really had to start from scratch at that point in figuring out how to be effective at the legislature. And really the most basic aspect of that is even just understanding what's going on. Mm-hmm. Because if you paid attention to the legislature across one session, one 2-year session, you may have over 1,000 bills in the House. You may have something like several hundred bills in the state Senate, which is a little smaller. But so I helped in that role, once he got into the legislature, helped him in developing and getting off the ground a legislative fellowship program, which at its core was aimed at helping Representative Fry be effective at the legislature and giving an opportunity for students, primarily here at UGA, just because of where he's based, exposure to the legislature and exposure to the kinds of experiences that could help them build careers. And then from there, that was really what led me to be interested in going to Washington and getting a public policy degree, simply because I felt like I needed sort of like deeper experience and expertise in public policy to be able to take on those responsibilities and recommend what really could be best for people in our state and across the country.
And I'll mention that legislative fellowship program is still ongoing, and several folks from UGA and the Applied Politics program, which is really a booming program here at UGA, are involved with that every year.
It is, and I think Representative Fry, often gives me way too much credit for this, but we helped get it off the ground, and then I helped a little bit when I was in grad school to sort of advise that program and help people understand how their experiences in that program could lead to grad school or job opportunities. But I have been really impressed with the ability of all the students that he brings into that program to, really pursue their interests and get really deep into the weeds of policy and legislating and campaign work too, because that's a whole other aspect of it that wasn't necessarily my interest, but a lot of people in that program are also interested in campaigns, and just astonished at how professional and smart these young kids are in his program that continue to participate in it today.
Right, right. So when was it that you went up to D.C. To go to American?
So it was August of 2013. So it's about a full year after graduating from Georgia, moved up to Washington.
So tell me about that program, policy analysis. How does that differ from say a traditional political science degree or a public affairs master's degree or something like that?
So these are programs that are relatively new, I believe, kind of in the broader scheme of like graduate programs, but sort of effectively what they are is a lot of very targeted training for how to, for the most part, either go to Capitol Hill in Washington and be effective as a policy expert for a member of Congress, or the path that I took was to go and work for a DC-based think tank. And so I work for one that's a progressive but nonpartisan think tank focused on public policies that impact people with low incomes, and we advocate for policies that would create more economic security for people with low incomes. And so the lessons that I took out of that program are really how to look at how a public program, like a healthcare program, how it's designed, how it could be more effectively designed, how it could more easily reach the people it's intended to reach, and then how to do some of the data analysis that helps support all of that work, and then really how to be effective in kind of a nonprofit environment where you have to balance a lot of different interests of having some expertise in how programs work, having some expertise in how to be effective on Capitol Hill and advocate for your views, and then having some other expertise in how to communicate that out to the broader public, because the public and then how they vote and the people that they send to Congress, that is sort of the input for governing and for the decisions that they make relative to our advocacy.
That's why I was going to ask the question of, were you taught or did you study how you blend that policy with political messaging via campaigns? And I guess not just campaigns, but public pressure campaigns, lobbying, things like that.
Yeah, that's actually a growing aspect of the work in public policy advocacy. And so it's something I wouldn't say I learned a ton about how to mesh political messaging and public policy advocacy in grad school, but what I've observed, particularly in state capitals, is public policy advocacy groups want to create issue-oriented campaigns to demonstrate not just that some nerds at a computer want to see a policy pass that expands healthcare or expands economic opportunity, but that real people in your district or in your state also want these programs, need these programs, and that it is incumbent on you, the public official, to act. And so there are principles of even political campaign messaging that go into some of those issue-oriented campaigns, but really just highlighting the need for, in our case, for the Georgia legislature and the Georgia governor to act.
So, how did you wind up at the Center on Budget and Policy Analysis?
So I interned there when I was in my public policy program, grad school, and then had another year where I was sort of back in education, working a little bit in education policy. But I really wanted to go back to Center on Budget and Policy Priorities because their mission is something that I'm just aligned with personally in a really strong way. And I, just having been a part of that organization, I feel like they are one of the most effective anti-poverty advocacy organizations in Washington. They go back to, I believe, I'll probably get this wrong, I think they were founded in like 1982 or 1983. They were founded largely in response to budget cuts that President Reagan was pursuing. And the founder, Bob Greenstein, was a veteran of the Carter administration.
That's right.
And then he wanted to have an institution in Washington that pushed back on those budget cuts because in his view, and I share this view now, decades later working in this, it's just vital for there to be organizations in Washington and also organizations in Atlanta that are advocating on behalf of people who may not have the power or the ability to advocate for themselves.
So you've mentioned education policy and poverty and income policies. What drew you, or why did you end up working in health policy and immigration policy?
So health policy came first.
Okay.
Health policy stems a little bit from my experience with Representative Fry here in Georgia before I went to Washington, in that the Medicaid expansion, which is part of the Affordable Care Act, was a hot issue of debate here in Atlanta in 2012, 2013, because, for people who may not know, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, it was presumed that every state would expand their Medicaid program, and Medicaid primarily is a health coverage program for people with low incomes.
Right.
And the idea was that every state would effectively have similar eligibility requirements, so that people with low incomes were covered in Medicaid, and then sort of as you move up the income scale, there were other policies in the ACA that gave coverage options to people with higher incomes.
Right.
So it was all supposed to be kind of a band of policy that kind of covered everybody, even though it wasn't the universal public coverage program, the Medicare for All that some people want. The Supreme Court in 2012 ruled that Medicaid expansion was optional for states, and Georgia declined the Medicaid expansion, and to this day they have continued to refuse it. But I was really interested in that issue when I was working with Representative Fry, and then that really became sort of the foundation of my graduate degree studies. So like, if I'm writing a paper and I can write it on any subject that I'm interested in, I'm writing a health policy paper. And then my internship at Center on Budget was a health policy internship. And to me, it just felt like, and I didn't have necessarily the language to describe it at the time, but now it's become clear to me as one of the most important racial equity issues in public policy.
I see.
And so to me, that's just aligned with my own personal values of creating policy that helps people who really need it.
I see. So you mentioned like your studies and everything in your project. Did you have a capstone project, a thesis project for your master's degree?
I did, and it's kind of a random thing. So it doesn't actually have anything to do with healthcare policy. For my capstone project, I participated in, I can't remember exactly what it was called, but it was effectively like an academic bowl team where me and 4 other colleagues in my graduate program, we were put on a team. We were given a policy challenge that we had to, over a short period of time, come up with a solution for. And the policy challenge was actually something I have no expertise in. It was addressing water shortages in the American West, out in the desert, and how to design a policy regime that would help cities, localities in places like Arizona or New Mexico or California design water use policies that would be sustainable in the face of climate change, in the face of droughts, and in the issues that you face out west. I've actually never been out west. I don't have a lot of expertise in this.
I was there last month. It is dry.
That's what I hear. And so it was. I appreciate that experience, even though I didn't, find a policy interest there, just to sort of get my feet wet with something else. But so yeah, it was kind of a random experience in my grad program.
So did you? This is a joke, obviously, but so did you advocate seeding the clouds with silver molecules, or was that part of the The smart use plan?
That would have been the easier solution. So I was in a very sort of econometric focused graduate program. And so we ended up actually spending a lot of time and giving a presentation basically on pricing mechanisms and how to design pricing mechanisms that would encourage people to conserve water and make that resource more sustainable.
Now, Kyle, words like econometric and pricing mechanism, we want people to watch these. But no, I mean, that's really interesting. Georgia has its own water policy issues, made easier, arguably, since the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the state. But who knows? That experience could come in handy down the line, even here in Georgia. So you're working on policy, you're going to grad school, you're working at this think tank. What makes you say, hey, let's start a podcast?
This was a very random idea. So Luke Boggs, who you talked to,
right.
And for anybody watching this interview, I'd encourage you to go back and watch your interview with Luke as well. I thought that was a really fascinating conversation. Luke Boggs and I got to know each other a little bit through our work with Representative Fry, but we didn't actually overlap a ton in our work with him. But he became Representative Fry's chief of staff after I had moved to Washington. And so Luke would call me and just to get a little bit of information about, how did the office work when you guys first started this program? What issues were you guys paying attention to? And we started to have these really long phone conversations because as you learned, Luke loves to talk and I love to talk to Luke.
I can confirm that.
We started to have these in-depth, long political conversations, and he is just an encyclopedia of knowledge about previous political eras. He can pull a random fact about LBJ. He can pull that up anytime that he wants to. He's just an encyclopedia of this information, and so we sort of really developed a rapport in that way, just talking about things, and being in Washington and staying in Washington after I graduated from grad school and beginning my career there. I really missed Georgia. I really wanted to do something that sort of felt, a little bit closer to home for me. And we went through a few different ideas. My public policy interest really sort of lended us to potentially starting some kind of a policy organization or doing things where we could highlight policy issues that we cared about. But that's doing that on the side of my public policy job, that didn't really work. But a podcast was something we could do relatively easily. And so one of the goals for the podcast that we felt we could, provide to sort of the general media environment about Georgia politics was to provide more in-depth analysis aimed at, really giving people context and explaining issues as they're considered at the state capitol in Atlanta. And I'm always really careful here because we didn't invent anything brand new. This is not something, that nobody else was doing at the time. Obviously Atlanta Journal-Constitution has, provided coverage of the Capitol for a long time. The Georgia Press Corps at the Capitol actually used to be much larger than it is now. And, between different outlets, you could kind of piece together some of this analysis if you were really, really looking for it. But it was hard to find, and it was hard to me, that one of the missing pieces was you would have coverage of the state legislature. It would tell you that, Governor so-and-so signed a budget. It increased funding for these programs, it decreased funding for these programs, or Governor so-and-so signed this legislation that does this. You could get kind of the bare bones information. You could get, I think, actually really good information about political campaigns because that's, that gets clicks, that gets readers and subscribers. But it was hard to mesh the two.
Right.
And it was hard to, I think, connect the dots between what was said on the campaign trail, the issues that different candidates prioritized, and then how that actually came out in governing when people were elected and given the opportunity to govern, and then how broader sort of cross currents in our culture and in our society are actually putting pressures on governing and campaigning. And so the one example that I think of a lot, that I think sort of illustrates the analysis that I'm really interested in, is we come back to this often, the Opportunity School District constitutional amendment proposed by Governor Nathan Deal during, I believe it was either the 2015 or 2016 legislative session. And Governor Deal was interested in, I think had a genuine interest in pursuing an education policy that he felt would provide more opportunity to students of color. And he caught some heat for advocating for this. I think he caught some heat from teachers and teacher organizations. But he made one comment in advocating for this legislation. He was speaking to, I think it was a group of African American civic leaders, and I think one of the groups involved in this was the NAACP, and he made a comment where he was defending his measure and criticizing the NAACP by saying something to the effect of, I thought you were for the advancement of colored people, calling back to the name of the organization. And it was covered as a gaffe. And it makes sense that it was a gaffe, and it was a relatively racially insensitive remark from somebody who's from an older generation. But to me, the sort of deeper thing going on there is that Governor Deal was using a lot of political capital on an issue that he felt he was going to make policy progress on behalf of people who largely didn't vote for him. And he was very, passionate about doing these sorts of things. You also talked to Brian Robinson, who was Governor Deal's communications director, and if you go back to that interview, Brian Robinson talks about how much Nathan Deal was personally touched by people who were benefiting from his criminal justice reforms. Right. And I would put this issue, the Opportunity School District issue, in a similar bucket where he was advocating on behalf of people who largely didn't vote for him. And if you look at the transition, and I don't know if we'll get more into this later, but the transition between the politics of Governor Deal's era and the politics of today's era in President Trump's Republican Party and Governor Kemp's Republican Party, I would struggle to find examples, very many examples, of either somebody like President Trump or, more particularly Governor Kemp, putting a lot of political capital on the line on behalf of a constituency that largely does not support him. And so we came back to Opportunity School District a lot on the podcast. We call it kind of a peach pod deep cut, because there was actually like a deeper level of meaning there. Even if you disagreed with him on the policy, even if you didn't think that these ideas were very good, it has now become uncommon for leaders to govern on behalf of people who don't support them, or much less common than it was, I think, in prior generations. And that's the kind of analysis that I think we think about a lot when trying to do this podcast.
Well, I don't want to leave that topic just yet. One example from the headlines, either yesterday or the day before, I believe there was the Georgia Republican Party opened a headquarters or something for African American outreach down in Clayton County. Do you see that as politics, or will public policy emerge from that in the post-Trump era?
I mean, in some ways, I think that's to be decided. So I believe Herschel Walker was there, and as we're talking today, Herschel Walker is a Republican nominee for the U.S. Senate, or he's announced that he will run.
Right.
He also has the backing of President Trump, so he is presumably the front runner in that race.
Right.
And he is a well-known football star for the University of Georgia. He would also be one of the most prominent black Republicans if he was to get elected and defeat Raphael Warnock in the next election. And there is this constant tension, I think, between some people in the Republican Party who see the demographic trends in Georgia and in other competitive states across the country, and they say we need a Republican Party that is willing to move with the people that we're trying to persuade, and one that is, receptive to the views of people that they would like to vote for them. And then there's, I think, a more reactionary portion of the party that President Trump energized that, frankly, I think may hesitate to vote for Herschel Walker and is not interested in a politics or sending people to be their elected representatives to then pursue policies on behalf of people who are not supportive of their candidate, of their guy. So like, there are very few instances of President Trump, for example, pursuing policies aimed at benefiting Democratic voters, and more often, those voters and those activists and people who would consider themselves to be Democrats are the enemies, are people who should be punished by the policies pursued by that administration. And so I do think that there's some tension there. Republicans will have to work that out. But I think in the short run, if you look at Republican politics in the last 5 years, the side that is interested in creating more division and not more unity is the side that appears to be winning out. And it'll be interesting to watch Herschel Walker's campaign in that context, because he draws a lot of his influence and his popularity in today's Republican Party from that endorsement from President Trump. But, if you look over in South Carolina, somebody like Tim Scott could be an example of a model that Herschel could follow, of somebody who's interested in broadening the Republican tent. Mm-hmm. But if you draw most of your political influence from one of the more divisive figures in the party, how do you then become one of the more inclusive figures? And that'll be a challenge, I think, for the party, something that'll be interesting to watch.
Well, we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the interview. But how did the podcast change with the 2020 election? Did you notice an uptick in listeners, an uptick in interest in what you were providing as Georgia became more and more prominent on the national scene?
Yeah, so I think we've had steady growth in our listeners, and it was interesting to be in the moment of the 2020 election where all of a sudden there were a bunch of other podcasts that were popping up, other media ventures that were popping up. Mm-hmm. A lot of people who come from maybe national outlets. I'm thinking of, in particular, of a podcast. I think it's called Gaining Ground, mm-hmm. and I believe it's connected to Crooked Media, the media company founded by some former Obama administration folks.
The Pod Save America folks.
Yeah, the Pod Save America crew. And so it was interesting to have these things pop up. And we've actually been over here kind of doing this stuff for a little while, and we were kind of covering things that are much more obscure and not quite as popular. And then now we're kind of thrown into this moment where there's, suddenly we are the center of the political universe all of a sudden. So yeah, it was interesting to see that building interest in Georgia, and to remember that when we started this, and one of the reasons we started it is because there was so little interest in Georgia. Another thing I think that's interesting relative to the 2020 election, I have approached the podcast in a way that's distinct from Luke, in that Luke has maintained connections to democratic institutions, democratic organizations, through his campaign work, through his party work. And I have never had institutional affiliations with the Democratic Party, in terms of my employment or what I'm really doing. I mean, I haven't actually worked on a lot of campaigns. So I kind of approached the podcast, and particularly my role in it, as to be sort of like a nonpartisan analyst, and to not really, to not go to bat on behalf of the Democratic Party. You could listen to the show, and you could hear that my views are typically more aligned with Democrats, but I'm not a Democratic pundit, and I don't always go to bat for them. And then I prioritized including the views of Republicans on our show, And for a while, we had a steady Republican panelist. I would talk to some Republican candidates for office, and I even might, in my own role, play devil's advocate by taking on the position of a Republican to argue, what they might feel on a particular issue. I found after the 2020 election, when so much of the Republican infrastructure bought into election misinformation, bought into policies that were aimed at eroding just the basic tenets of our democracy, that my sort of nonpartisan and sort of removed from it all analyst position, that was actually tougher for me to maintain than I would have thought. Because I didn't want to bring people on the show who would spread misinformation. And I didn't want to buy into some of these narratives that I thought were, not just the normal give and take between Democrats and Republicans, but actually, I think, legitimate threats to our democratic governance. And so that was something that changed a lot for me after the 2020 election, because if you had asked me before, we became very familiar with President Trump's antics between 2017, well, really going back from 2015, when he first came down that escalator, all the way through his presidency. I would have said that was much more isolated to him as an individual, more so than the institution of the Republican Party. And I honestly was shocked in the days following the election how much of Republican institutions have bought into election misinformation, how that led to the passage of legislation in Georgia in 2021 that made it harder to vote, and what that means for our democracy going forward. So that was another big piece of how 2020, I think, changed my approach on the podcast and my view of politics generally.
Well, let's explore that. You like Luke, and very much unlike several of the people who've participated in this oral history project, have only really known Georgia politics with the Republican Party in charge as the governing majority party. So, normally I ask folks, what explains the Republican takeover from the Democratic Party? But what I want to talk to you about is, and you mentioned it, how has the Republican Party, in your view, as a policy analyst, as somebody interested in politics, how has the Republican Party changed as a governing party over the time you have participated in policy and politics?
So I find this period very fascinating, particularly when Governor Deal comes into office in 2010. He wins the 2010 election, comes into office in 2011. You can point to examples early in his term where he did do much in the same way that Governor Kemp has done in his first term. He passed legislation that was sort of the embodiment of grassroots conservative anger at the Obama administration, at Washington, at the state of politics. Governor Deal passed or signed one of the most restrictive immigration laws in the country in 2011. Governor Deal also signed abortion restrictions, I believe it was either 2011 or 2012. And that was, I wouldn't say necessarily a big part of his first term, but I think he definitely felt, I guess, some responsibility to deliver on behalf of the people that had voted for him. And that's totally understandable. All politicians, I think, feel that way to some extent. But then you go into Nathan Deal's second term, and he's at the end of his career. This is probably the last office he'll ever hold. And he makes several high-profile policy pushes that anger the base of the Republican Party, and at minimum are not things that they would love to see him doing. So, Governor Deal leads an effort to increase the gas tax in Georgia that conservative members of his party called the largest tax increase in state history. Governor Deal argued for it, saying we needed investment to maintain our roads, and it was a safety issue, and this is sort of a legitimate, substantive governing thing that we, as the party in power, have to do. He pushed back on conservatives in his party on the issues of religious liberty and on campus carry legislation. At least initially, there's those two high-profile vetoes that he makes. And he generally shows, I think, a willingness to sort of separate himself from the grassroots of the party. And his ability to do that, his willingness to do that, I think is a major driver of public policy direction in Georgia at the time. Then you fast forward to Governor Kemp's first term, and really Governor Kemp's campaign for governor. He, at least to date, I think has demonstrated much less willingness to separate himself from the grassroots of the party, and actually much more willingness and much more enthusiasm to act on their behalf. And so, this, I think, example comes from when conservative members of his party wanted to push one of the nation's strictest abortion bans early in his first term. It's interesting, Governor Kemp, his first impulse, and I think this ended up being reported, was that Governor Kemp wanted kind of a smaller scale abortion ban law to be put in place, to be the priority for Republicans, and it was one that would trigger a ban on abortion if the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade. But conservative members of his party wanted a more aggressive abortion ban that would outright ban abortion in the state, or ban it after 6 weeks, I think was the policy there, and then have that be a law designed to draw a court challenge and potentially put that law in front of the Supreme Court and have that law potentially be one of the ones that overturns Roe v. Wade. So conservative Republicans, they want a more aggressive position. Initially, Governor Kemp says, no, maybe we should take kind of a middle road, a less aggressive road. And then he backs down and he backs what the conservative base of the party, in the legislature, what they want. I also think this is true in his management of the COVID-19 pandemic. I certainly could imagine a second-term governor deal being much more willing
Governor Kemp?
So like if you imagine a second-term governor deal being in charge during the COVID-19 pandemic.
I see. Sorry about that.
No, that's okay. Him being more willing to be more out front about safety measures, to govern in a way that is much more focused on kind of the responsible governing element that the challenge demands, and much less on the sort of conspiratorial fear-mongering that happens at county Republican parties and happens online on Facebook. And I think Governor Kemp, he would probably disagree with this analysis, but I think he has been more willing to sort of embolden the more conspiratorial elements of the grassroots Republican base. And to me, that's a significant shift because Republicans still control the entire state. All apparatuses of state government, they hold every statewide office. And on the state level, they control the state house and the state senate. And Democrats basically have very little to no ability to impact governing. So it really is on Republican leaders to chart the path forward for the state. And if they allow portions of their party that I think are at least in my own view, I think will send us in a very bad direction, not just in terms of policies that I don't like, but in terms of things that would erode basic tenets of our democracy, would make things like a global pandemic worse. Governor Deal is somebody I look at that was kind of a bulwark against those forces, and Governor Kemp seems much less of a bulwark against those forces. And that, to me, is a significant pivot point in the way in which the Republican Party is changing, and because Republicans run everything here, that impacts the way in which Georgia changes.
You mentioned Governor Kemp's efforts or willingness to reach out to the base, to try and motivate the base. But there has been, at least since the election, a lot of pushback or antagonism against Governor Kemp from within perhaps the more conservative elements of, or maybe conservative is not the right term, the more the elements of the Republican Party here in Georgia that are loyal and loyal supporters of President Trump. Is that the case, or is that just a perception out there from what you've seen?
I do think it's the case, and so I think somewhat, unfortunately for Governor Kemp, I think he's ended up in a political no man's land, because many of these people were the people he was acting on behalf of when he pursued the abortion ban legislation that he did, when he made the decisions on COVID policies that he did. But the one instance that I think Governor Kemp made a very significant move to not represent the interests of that wing of the party and to push back on them was to flatly reject that he had any legal authority to overturn the presidential election in Georgia. And then that, because so much of that party is identified with President Trump and buys into President Trump's misinformation about elections, that really, in some ways, is actually like the true red line issue for that segment of the party. And then Governor Kemp went against them on that, and then now has been the subject of their fury at him. Now, it's an open question, I think, the extent to which that fury means anything, because that segment of the party has not put forth a legitimate primary challenger for Governor Kemp. At least as we sit here today, it appears he's very likely to win renomination for governor in the 2022
You're
race.
suggesting that Vernon Jones is not a true threat to Governor Kemp's renomination.
Yeah, the former Democratic member of the state house and a Democratic member of, I'm forgetting the county. Is he?
Oh, he was
County?
No. He was DeKalb County CEO.
CEO,
Mm-hmm.
that's right. Who himself has a bunch of a voting record that is, some might, especially his detractors in the Republican Party, would describe as progressive, one that has embraced the issue of abortion and allowed it. I wouldn't today consider him to be a real threat. I do think he is sort of a avatar for Republicans' anger, but they just don't have someone with the cachet that can actually challenge Kemp in the party. And I do think that is an illustration of, I think that they bought into the grassroots of the party too much. But they have not allowed...
Who's they? The state party?
The state party, I think in particular here, I'm thinking of Governor Kemp, of the legislature when they have acted on behalf of the anger and the grassroots.
I see.
But they have not, at least to date, allowed them to get enough of an institutional foothold in the party to present a real challenger to Governor Kemp. They may have a real one to Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger. Brad Raffensperger is, I think, even a worse, in the eyes of the Trump-aligned base of the party, is even a worse violator of President Trump's wishes related to the election than Brian Kemp was. But they haven't landed on a challenger that can beat Kemp, I think.
Well, we'll talk a little bit more when we get to recapping elections and the future. But what about on the flip side, the Democratic Party? You mentioned when you wanted to start the podcast that nobody really paid attention to Georgia. There wasn't much energy in Georgia. How has the Democratic Party changed since the time you got involved in 2012 to almost a decade later now?
I think the most concrete illustration of the way in which the Democratic Party has changed comes between the 2014 campaigns of Jason Carter for governor and Michelle Nunn for U.S. Senate, and the strategy that they pursued of distancing themselves from President Obama, who at the time admittedly was relatively unpopular in this state, distancing themselves from Democratic leadership in Washington and sort of adopting a approach that I don't think me or Luke have made up this name, but it's sort of like the GOP light strategy of people who, particularly older people who maybe earlier in their lives voted for Democrats, maybe voted for Jimmy Carter, Jason Carter's grandfather, or voted for Sam Nunn. then became Republicans and voted consistently for Republicans. But hey, do you remember this good era of Democrats with Jimmy Carter and Sam Nunn? Let's let Jason Carter and Michelle Nunn bring that back. And so to try to bring some of those maybe swingy, but probably really more like always conservative, but Democrat to Republican voters, try to bring those voters back. That I think is probably the kind of defining characteristic of those campaigns. Fast forward to the 2018 governor's race and to the 2020 presidential race, those are really defined by the Stacey Abrams playbook of not positioning yourself as a GOP light or as the more responsible version of conservative governance that you've known and loved in Georgia for so long, but instead energizing and engaging and building infrastructure to talk to voters who have been left out of the process. Now, they may have been left out of the process because they've been targeted by voting policies that made it more difficult for them to vote. They may have been left out of the process because they didn't feel like people in Atlanta or Washington were advocating on their behalf. Or they may have been left out of the process because they are literally left out when no candidates come to their town or come to their house, come and ask what their interests are. And I think Stacey Abrams is the key representative of this, but she is also sort of the leader of a large group, a large infrastructure of organizations in Georgia that has flipped that model on its head and said, no, we need to go and talk to those voters. We need to go engage them. We need to go make sure they're registered, go make sure they know what requirements they have to meet to be able to vote, and make sure they have the ability to vote. And then while you're also doing that, demonstrating that if they were to vote for you, if they were to give you governing power, you would govern on their behalf. And that, I think, is sort of the key difference between the approach in 2014 and then the approach in 2018 by the Abrams campaign, and then all of that infrastructure that got filtered into the effort that helped Joe Biden win in Georgia in 2020 and ultimately helped John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock win those 2 U.S. Senate runoffs.
Has there been a similar shift in policy or attempts to affect policy outcomes in the General Assembly, similar to a push to change outcomes on the campaign trail among Democrats?
I think there is a willingness, particularly among the younger, up-and-coming Democratic lawmakers, I think there is a willingness to be a more full-throated advocate for the issues that you care about. I think that is limited somewhat by the lack of institutional power for Democrats in the legislature. So like if you were to look at the policy stances of Democrats, going back even to 2010, really 2010, 2012-ish, Democrats stand for fully funding the QBE education funding formula. They stand for expanding Medicaid, and they stand for an approach to economic growth in this state that takes climate change into account and deals, and in part, or sort of also tied to that, deals with issues like Metro Atlanta traffic by supporting things like transit, which would be more environmentally friendly and address the traffic issues that people aren't happy about in this state. And I don't think largely that positioning, that those sort of like concrete positions on those issues really hasn't changed very much. But I think the framing when you argue for those policies has changed. I think has become a little bit more progressive, and the willingness to not necessarily feel like you have to find a Republican champion to join you or to frame something in a way that Republicans can like this, but instead to, a lot of them I think are, I guess would maybe say sort of like prouder members of a progressive Democratic Party that has these distinct values, and then that is making commitments to go govern on those values if they get elected.
So why do you think it took so long for the Democratic Party to perhaps regroup and embrace the approach of Stacey Abrams as opposed to the approach of a Roy Barnes, of a Jason Carter, of a Michelle Nunn?
Largely, I think it's because different people had to come to power. If you go back to, and this is history I'm less familiar with, but many of, or at least some of Democratic leadership in the 80s and 90s became Republican leaders in the 2000s. I believe, am I correct that Sonny Perdue was actually the Senate Majority Leader for the Democratic Party before he became the Republican governor?
That is correct, as late as 1998.
And Nathan Deal was a Democratic member of Congress
until April 1995.
Before he became the state's Republican governor. So I think to some extent there is a sort of the old guard, the oldest members of the Democratic Party, or that came up as Democrats. By the time they're older in the late years of their career, they're Republicans. And then so there's sort of a new group of people that has to come up. I think Stacey Abrams is involved in that group of new and upcoming people. But then even beyond her, somebody like State Representative Bee Nguyen, who's currently running for Secretary of State, State Representative Josh McLaurin, who was elected recently, I think 1 or 2 cycles ago. There's a lot of examples of people who would be notable members of the Democratic caucus in the House or the Senate who just weren't a part of Georgia politics 15 years ago.
I see.
And then those people, I think, are drawn to progressive politics, to being a Democrat, for different reasons than the more conservative members of the Democratic Party were a generation ago. And so it's really their sort of coming to power within the party that helps reshape, I think, their approach to elections and their approach to governing.
Is there a similar trend on the Republican side? Is it that generational change has shifted the priorities, or maybe not necessarily the priorities, the approach of Republicans in the state? Or is that something that you can look to an exogenous force like a Donald Trump presidency and campaign?
I mean, I think you could look at both. I do think it's notable that Governor Kemp is the first lifelong Republican governor that the state has had. And so, if you trace back through his career, he's coming up in the party as a Republican. He's, I imagine, probably has just stronger personal relationships with the grassroots base of the party. And so, he probably feels a little bit more tied just personally to acting on their behalf, just because of his background and where he comes from. And yeah, I think for younger members of the party, they're going to come up in a similar way. If you think about somebody like Houston Gaines, who's a state representative here in the Athens area, was a part of the college Republicans, was kind of known as a up-and-coming Republican figure, and if he continues to go on and has a successful career and maybe becomes maybe the most prominent Republican official in Georgia in 10 or 20 years, he'll be another one of those that his entire career will be, stem from the modern Republican Party and the Republican organizations he was a part of.
So based on our conversation of the last 20 minutes or so, it would seem that the 2018 election here in Georgia, especially the primaries, are really, really pivotal in that evolution in politics, both on the Democratic side and the Republican side. So, of course, you're up in Washington, but no doubt you followed these campaigns and these elections. Were you surprised at the outcomes of the Democratic gubernatorial primary between Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans, and on the other hand, the gubernatorial primary between, or at least the runoff between Brian Kemp and Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle? What were your takeaways?
So I would say, to start with the Democrats, I would say I was surprised at the margin between Stacey Abrams and Stacey Evans in that campaign, in the primary campaign, in part because Stacey Evans is a well-known, very effective legislator, and I think really well-liked by her Democratic colleagues in the House. And she got a lot of backing from her fellow members of the state House. And I think that suggested that she might have a broader popularity among the Democratic primary electorate, and that and might suggest that that race would have been closer. But at the same time, I think Stacey Abrams, I think it becomes clear through that result, through her result of nearly winning the governor's race, and then all the groundwork that's laid into 2020 is her investments in infrastructure for voter engagement, I think really made the difference. And her sort of newish theory of how to campaign. I'm less familiar with these particular tactics, but there was basically the sort of prior leading strategy of raising a bunch of money up front and then holding that money to run a bunch of TV advertisements towards the end of a campaign, if I'm getting that right.
Yes,
and,
yep.
And her strategy of spending a lot of money early to build organization, voter engagement organization, and that different approach sort of carrying the day. So that I think leads me to be a little surprised by the margin, but I think explains a lot of what has happened in Georgia politics since. I think on the Republican side, I don't think that it is particularly surprising that Governor Kemp wins a runoff against Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle. And I'm sure most folks who watch this will probably know, but Casey Cagle's I think he was lieutenant governor for, I think, at least 10 or 12 years or something before running for governor.
2007 until 2018.
And, he was somebody, particularly relative to Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan, who follows him. Casey Cagle was somebody who I think had a lot more institutional power in the Republican Party and in the state Senate in particular. And so, but at the same time, the party at that period is going through this, basically a rejection of a lot of their institutional leading figures. President Trump makes a big deal of basically how much he despises John McCain and his run for president in 2016, and I think that even going back to David Perdue's 2014 Senate race as an outsider. All of those currents in the party, I think, are putting institutional Republican figures kind of on the defensive, making it less likely that they can win elections. And so I wouldn't say that I was surprised. I think one of the main takeaways for me is I think it's likely Brian Kemp wins that runoff even if he doesn't get the Trump endorsement, like if Trump just stays out of it.
Right.
But the sea change that happens in that primary when he gets the Trump endorsement, to me, is sort of the main takeaway about how you can analyze the Republican Party going forward. Just, getting that backing from President Trump, it almost determines elections now. At least, when you look at the Herschel Walker in this Senate race, like the assumption now is that a person who has never run for office, who was a prominent figure in Georgia in the 1980s, but who hasn't really been a prominent figure since, is the front runner in the Republican Party for U.S. Senate simply because he has Donald Trump's endorsement.
Right.
I mean, you see that really come to life in that Kemp endorsement in the 2018 runoff.
So when we're, fast forward to the general election in 2018, you've talked about being surprised by the margin of victory that Stacey Abrams had over Stacey Evans, and again Brian Kemp's incredible margin over Lieutenant Governor Cagle, something like 157 of 159 counties. Were you surprised at how close after? We've talked 2014, 2010, 2006, how close the Democrats came to winning, not just the governor's race, but there wasn't much difference between the governor's race down through all the constitutional offices. Were you surprised at how close the Democrats came in 2018 here in Georgia?
Yes and no. I think one of the main driving forces, in addition to the institutional work that Stacey Abrams did in terms of voter engagement, I actually think one of the main driving forces behind how close that race was that it was the first midterm election for a persistently unpopular president. And so if you go back to 2006 for the Democrats or to 2010 for the Republicans, those bad midterm years where you have unpopular leading figures in the party in the presidency have really driven a lot of down ballot success for the party out of power, the party who is upset, who is enraged about what's going on in Washington. And for so many voters, what they know about politics is how they feel about the President of the United States. So I do think in that respect, I wasn't surprised at how close it was. But my feeling coming out of that race was I was wondering if that was the high water mark for Democrats in the state, at least in the short term. Because that's the election where Democrats are most engaged, they're most passionate about getting out to vote, and Republicans have just won the presidency. They're now dealing with the realities of governing and the ways in which that makes you unpopular. And so their enthusiasm is somewhat depressed, I think. And so I think I'm actually more surprised that that momentum carried through from 2018 to 2020. And for Democrats to actually get over the top in a statewide race for Joe Biden. And then the runoffs as well, although the runoffs are in somewhat of a different category.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah. But yeah, so I'm not surprised there. I think it lays interesting groundwork when you come to 2022 because President Trump was a one-term president, Governor Kemp's reelection happens in a midterm for a Democratic president, not a second midterm for a second-term Republican president.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is what made it possible for Democrats to almost carry the day in 2018 is, on the one hand, the party building efforts of Stacey Abrams and her organization, as well as the sort of Trump backlash that accompanies any sort of midterm election when the incumbent president is unpopular. So 2020 presidential election here in Georgia, there had always been conversations, Georgia's going to be a swing state. This is what we talked about in 2008, 2012, 2016, and it never turned out that way. Why was 2020 different than 2016, 2012, 2008?
I think sort of in two directions. The first direction is the maturation of all of the voter engagement efforts. Just spending more time doing it over the years, getting to engage more voters, particularly voters of color and voters that Democrats believe are more progressive in their views, but just haven't been engaged in the past. And so those efforts really have matured over the time that Stacey Abrams is implementing her playbook. And then I think if you look back for President Obama in 2008 to 2010 to 2012, Obama's popularity goes down significantly in the lead up to the midterms, but then by his reelection bid, he's largely recovered. For President Trump, his popularity declined and then stayed very low throughout the rest of the term.
Very stable.
Very stable. He has his hardcore supporters that keeps him, interestingly, he never reaches the depths of like President Bush's unpopularity, because Republicans abandoned President Bush, 2006, 2007. President Trump has his hardcore supporters, but his popularity, his ceiling is way too low for his own reelection chances. And I think that unpopularity and President Trump's embrace of a sort of a politics of chaos is just largely incompatible with the not very political, like somewhat marginally politically engaged sort of average suburban voter. And so Democrats benefit from their engagement for voters in their own base, and then this long, persistent frustration with President Trump that, as it goes on and on and on, I think pushes more and more suburban voters to the Democrats. And then the Democrats benefit again by nominating someone who is kind of the antidote to what your marginally involved voter wants against President Trump, which is somebody who's just a return to normal, a return to competence, and you get this sort of like competence versus chaos framing that I think plays particularly well for, sort of marginally engaged voters in the suburbs.
So we mentioned the runoffs. Historically, Democrats have done terribly in runoff elections in Georgia. You have to go back to the 90s that a Democrat had won. Why were John Ossoff and Raphael Warnock able to win head-to-head runoffs against David Perdue, an incumbent, and Kelly Loeffler, a sitting senator with a tremendous war chest?
I think there's a lot of things that go on.
It's a lot to unpack, I know.
But
simple question, right?
I think on behalf of the way in which Senators Loeffler and Perdue conducted themselves during the runoff, they doubled down on a strategy of getting maximum engagement from the most passionate Republican voters, even if that lost them support among marginal Republican voters or voters who may not be very enthused to vote at all. And I think Kelly Loeffler does this primarily through, a lot of her messaging sort of basically directly targeting like racial justice advocates from the summer of 2020. That messaging carries on through the runoff. I think David Perdue does this by framing John Ossoff as sort of a puppet for both China and Islamic extremism by drawing on relatively tenuous connections from John Ossoff's background. And you have deployed that political strategy in a state, not a state that just voted for Donald Trump by 5 or 7 or 10 points, but a state that voted for Joe Biden and voted for a Democrat for the first time since 1992. So you've put that strategy out there for an electorate that has signaled, narrowly, but signaled that it wants Democratic governance, or at a minimum, it at least rejects continued governance by Donald Trump. And then on, excuse me, and then on John Ossoff's part, on Raphael Warnock's part, I actually think there's sort of two different things going on in those campaigns. Mm-hmm. John Ossoff, I think, was laser focused on a message of Georgia just backed Joe Biden. Georgia backed Joe Biden and the country backed Joe Biden because they have largely rejected the chaotic governance of the last 4 years, and in particular the chaotic governance addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, addressing the issues of racial justice in the summer of 2020, and very clearly sending a message that they want something different. And in prior races, if John Ossoff had taken more of a Jason Carter, Michelle Nunn approach, he might have positioned himself as an independent person who would go and be a representative of Georgia, represent Georgia's interests, regardless of what the president thought or regardless of what anyone else in Congress thought. Instead, John Ossoff positions himself as, you are sending me to Washington to go work with Joe Biden, to go accomplish the things that Joe Biden campaigned on, and to deliver those results for you. And it was a very concrete, he had that health, jobs, justice slogan that he was using, but I thought it was notable just how deliberate he was in saying, send me to Washington to go work with Joe Biden. Raphael Warnock, I think there's a similar theme there, but drawing on his background as a pastor, I think he kind of takes on more of a moral leader approach, talking about his own background and advocating for people for healthcare access, for all the things that he has advocated on from the pulpit, just as a religious leader and as a moral leader. But I think he has a little bit more runway than Jon Ossoff does because he is running against I think, a more unpopular opponent, and an opponent in Kelly Loeffler who just has fewer ties to Republican voters because she's so new, because she was somebody who practically came out of nowhere when Governor Kemp appointed her to the Senate, and somebody who I think had taken positions that were more out of step with the Georgia electorate than David Perdue had. And so I think there's a couple different things going on there, but they both push in the direction of sending Democrats to Washington to, give control of the U.S. Senate to the Democrats, which is a big thing for the state of Georgia to do given its recent history of the last 20 years, and then to empower them to govern. And I think that's notable in sort of the message that Democrats delivered in the runoffs.
So much has been said about President Trump's impact on the runoffs. What do you think his impact was on Republican turnout and Democratic turnout in those January 5th runoffs?
I mean, I think in some ways I defer to people who are much more data-minded than me, but I think the data suggests that there was a big drop-off among Republican voters that voted in the general election and voted for Republicans and probably would have voted for Republicans in the runoff, but felt, because of how aggrieved Donald Trump was about his own result in the state, and because of all of the dirt he kicked up in the faces of Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, that those people didn't stand up for him adequately. And I think some of this anger was also directed at Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue for not standing up for Donald Trump adequately, that some of those voters just stayed home. And that ultimately, it is somewhat ironic, given that the stakes of the election was full control of Washington by Democrats. And Donald Trump and Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue had organized so much of their political identities around being opposed to the types of things Democrats would do. You know, they're very opposed to progressive liberal governance, and they're constantly demonizing the kinds of ideas that Democrats have. And yet at the end of the day, the red line seemed to be support for Donald Trump himself and not the issues that he stood for or the way in which he stood against the things Democrats would do. But I think ultimately that, coming back to the Herschel Walker endorsement, the Brian Kemp endorsement, so much of this party is organized around Trump as a figure himself and not necessarily the governing ideas or policies that he stands for.
So that's a good segue into this question, which is talking about the evolution of partisan voting patterns in the suburbs. Was it simply a rejection of Donald Trump, his tone, his demeanor, or was it a shift in actual policies that matter to voters in those areas? Or, to give you an out, is it a combination of both?
I think it starts as a rejection of Donald Trump. I think it starts as a rejection of the chaotic politics that he embraced, that he helped continue on in so many of the actions that he took as president. I wonder, though, in the long run, if that sort of initial, sort of bad taste in your mouth for an average suburban voter who may not be very partisan, may not be very ideological, and who probably, votes Republican because their family votes Republican, they voted Republican for a long time, that sort of initial push away from Republicans opens up some of those voters' eyes to, if you're willing to vote for a Democrat once, would you then consider doing it again and again and again? And if one of the reasons you might consider doing that is because they have more appealing policy ideas, political ideas, more appealing ways of conducting themselves than Republicans do, is that shift longer and more enduring? And so I think it opens up an opportunity. I don't think it necessarily seals the deal for Democrats that these voters are in their camp, they're going to stay there. But Democrats have held similar positions and have been on sort of the more popular side of some issues like education funding and Medicaid expansion. They have been on the more popular side of some of those issues going back to 2012, 2014, but they still couldn't reach those voters. And now that they've been pushed away, I think it opens up a new opportunity for them to reach those voters. I think the challenge, though, is that Democrats are given power in Washington right now. And are they going to be able to deliver on the power that they're given? Or do those voters who moved from Republicans to Democrats look at the Democrats as they're no different than the Republicans? Maybe they're nicer, maybe they're not as divisive, but then they go to Washington and they blow smoke and they don't get anything done either. And then maybe those people back away from the process rather than continue to be engaged. So I think that highlights, I think, the challenge for Democrats in keeping those voters in their camp, that if they want to present themselves as the responsible, substantive governing party, when they're given the opportunity to govern, they have to deliver.
But for listeners or viewers in the future, the context that Kyle and I are having this conversation in is the Democrats in Washington are currently negotiating with themselves over the major infrastructure, the Build Back Better infrastructure package that President Biden has proposed. So that will be for the future viewers to know how that turns out. But that's the context in which we're having this conversation. So, we talked about 2018, 2020. We see voters in the suburbs, especially the inner suburbs, Cobb County, Gwinnett, north DeKalb County, trending towards the Democratic side. Stacey Abrams, Joe Biden, Ossoff, Warnock. But at the same time, rural voters, which were very conservative, very Republican before 2018, have become even more Republican, something like 85% in some of these counties. Is there anything Democrats can do to stem that tide in rural areas, small towns, or do they even need to, in your opinion?
In my view, and in how much I value responsible governance, I think they need to make that a priority, because there are still there are still a lot of people who live in rural Georgia, and in my view, many of the policies pursued by leaders, even leaders from both parties for the last 20 or 30 years, has helped contribute to economic decline in many of those regions. The lack of Medicaid expansion or even some conservative alternative that actually provides investment in healthcare in rural Georgia has left rural hospitals to close, has left people without healthcare access. So much of our economic development is centered around Metro Atlanta and some of the other metro areas in the state. And economic opportunities are fewer and further between in some of these more rural counties. And so I think Democrats should take it upon themselves to offer solutions that would benefit people living in those places. And I think they should do it even if those people will not end up voting for them. Sort of similar, coming back to the theme of Governor Deal and in some of the issues that he pursued. I just think that's an element of responsible governance to do so. I think the challenge there for Democrats politically is Republicans have organized themselves so much around cultural issues, around issues of racial resentment, and around issues of sort of rejecting a changing America, that for many of those voters, is it really going to matter to them and to their vote if Democrats come in and they have a new economic development program that brings a big new employer and puts a hospital back in town and creates more economic opportunity in those places? Will some of those conservative voters just say, that's great, but Democrats aren't for people like me, not for just who I am as a person. And it's great that they did those things, but I'm still not going to vote for them. And I think that's a challenge for them in terms of, Democrats have so much organized themselves around governing, around making progressive changes that make real impacts in people's lives. But Republicans may not even be voting on those things. And so that's I think a difficult question for Democrats to answer. I come down on the side of, do it anyway and let the cards fall where they will.
So the saving grace for the Republican Party in Georgia in 2018 and maybe the silver bullet for Democrats in 2020 were the margins in those large exurban counties, especially North Metro, where you're from. Do Democrats, are they making inroads in those areas as well? And if so, are those trends likely to continue? And if so, why?
So as we talked about at the beginning, I'm from Cherokee County. I think a funny thing about Cherokee County, especially as me growing up to be kind of a more progressive person, is that Cherokee County, when I was in high school, was, I think for one of those elections in either 04 or 06, was the most Republican county in the entire country. So I think when you look at a county like Cherokee and some of the other counties further out, the baseline for Democrats in those counties was so low that I think you did see in 2018 and 2020 margins shrink a little bit. Democrats did a little bit better, but because they were so low to begin with, that didn't result in anybody winning elections or really any changes of power in those places. Where it'll go from here, I think it's tough to tell. If the thing that I remember about Cherokee County growing up is that when I first moved there, I was a kid, but I remember this from what my parents say, it didn't really feel like Metro Atlanta. Like you were far enough away from Atlanta that you kind of felt like you were in your own place. To me, it's the way that Athens feels now. Like, Athens doesn't actually feel like Metro Atlanta to me. It feels kind of like its own place. But if you don't change development patterns, if you don't change some of the policies around that, and Atlanta continues to sprawl, northern Cherokee County and counties above that, and maybe even Athens at some point, is just going to be another suburb of Atlanta.
Jackson County there are communities in Jackson County, which is just to the north of Athens. The fastest growing communities are in Jackson County, right up along I-85. You talked about factories and developments. The major Korean battery factory is going in right up in Jackson County. So, and I think more and more people are living in Jackson County who commute into metropolitan Atlanta. And when I moved here in 2008, you never would have thought of, I'll live in Jackson County and commute to Fulton County. That's, why would you? Or even Gwinnett, at least the far side of Gwinnett.
I commuted from Athens to Buckhead for 4 months in my first job out of undergrad, and it was rough. It's not a fun experience.
You just don't know what it's going to look when you get to the Lenox Road, Cheshire Bridge exit, or you might have to sneak around Peachtree, DeKalb Airport and hope for the best on Buford Highway.
But I do think on that point about growth, part of what I think is contributing to political change in Georgia is that a lot of people who live in Metro Atlanta aren't originally from Georgia. They may be from Michigan, they may be from Massachusetts. They tend to come from places where the politics is a little bit different, and then they bring those views down here. And to the extent that people continue to move to Georgia, but if the cheap housing option for them is out in Jackson County or out north of Cherokee or out north of Gwinnett, up 985 or whatever, if those people end up in those communities I think will begin to look more like Gwinnett or Cobb. Whereas if they end up closer to the city, you would have the situation that Democrats face in a lot of other states where you have just increasing concentration of Democratic voters in urban areas that I think serves to their detriment when you talk about redistricting.
Wisconsin.
Yeah. And so that I think is one factor that you're thinking about in what's going to happen to the exurbs is like
Right.
how Atlanta grows, how other metro areas in the state grow to the extent that they're growing.
So we can, let's go ahead and talk about the census and demographics. Yeah, special session starts or has started?
I think it starts early November, probably in about a couple weeks.
Okay, so special session, several things might be taken up, but we know that redistricting and reapportionment are going to take place. What do you expect to come out of redistricting, and how much does that demographic change play into it?
So I am interested in, because Democrats do not have any foothold in state government, and I actually think this is one of the most important storylines about redistricting, is that Democrats made gains in the state legislature in 2018. They picked up, I want to say more than 10 seats. I can't remember the exact number.
I think it was 12.
It was 12.
I think.
And then that put them within striking distance in 2020. It's kind of an outside shot, but they might have had a chance to pick up and control the state house. And that would have entirely changed the dynamic around redistricting, I think, with both the House and the Senate having to sign off on maps and Democrats having like a real institutional power in that process. But I think to some extent Republicans, they did the right things for their own party by protecting those state lawmakers. In some ways, I think they insulated their state lawmakers in more competitive seats from backlash against President Trump. I think Speaker David Ralston plays a big part in that, in his approach to managing the House. And then because of that, they maintain full control of redistricting this time. And so I'm watching to see to what extent do Republicans feel that they can entrench their power in the same way that Democrats attempted to in the early 2000s with their redistricting. And then I'm really interested in where that happens. Because to date, we've seen draft congressional maps. And the Republicans, I believe it was Lieutenant Governor Jeff Duncan's office, released a draft map for the congressional districts that did not make an attempt to make it easy for Republicans to win both the 6th and 7th congressional districts currently held by Democrats. Instead, they left the 7th district as a relatively safe Democratic district and had the 6th be more competitive. And then I believe they also, the map would estimate it to be giving them a potential opportunity to pick up, I believe it's the 2nd congressional district, is the Sanford Bishop's district down in southwest Georgia. So that I think is one early signal about how they might approach the congressional map. You could imagine that there are other maps that may come from other portions of the Republican legislature that may be more aggressive on the congressional front. But you have the congressional maps, then you have the maps in the state House and the state Senate. And I have a theory, we'll see, and for people who watch this in the future, you can let me know if I'm right or wrong about this. But if I'm Republicans looking at the best place to try to entrench their own power right now, it's in the state legislature, I feel like. If you get too aggressive with the congressional district maps, you might put yourself in a position where, maybe you can win back the 6th and the 7th, and maybe even take the 2nd in the 2022 elections, but you get to 24, 26, 28, if you see the same kind of demographic changes you've seen, maybe suddenly many more of the seats that you thought were safe are now potentially easy pickups for Democrats. Whereas in the state legislature, given that these are maps drawn by state legislators and by Republican leadership in the state House and state Senate, my belief is that they look at national politics today and they can have their influence on national politics in the way that they draw the congressional map. But to be honest, the party really may not be aligned with the views of legislative leadership in terms of if Republican legislators think, oh, I'm going to burn some political capital, draw some maps that are obviously gerrymandered, it's going to bring some political heat, is it worth it to try to send some Republicans to Washington? Or is it more worth it to burn that political capital, to take some of the heat being viewed as a gerrymander, to entrench Republican power in this state where they currently maintain much more power and where just through their own actions they can drive the policy direction of the state for the next decade. And so my view, my prediction is that that's where they will attempt to entrench their own power. Some of those maps may look more gerrymandered than the congressional maps. That's where I think that their focus is going to be.
Well, like you said, we'll have to wait and see.
I could be very wrong.
Well,
I have been before.
Well, see, that's why I'm a historian. I never had to predict anything.
Yeah.
So, but you mentioned earlier the so-called election integrity bill, the voting bill that is a direct product or a direct byproduct rather of President Trump's reaction to the 2020 election. Or what's the stated purpose behind the election integrity bill, and what's your take on it as a policy analyst, a progressive-leaning policy analyst?
So I think the stated rationale for backing that bill from the Republicans who wrote it, the Republicans who supported it, and Governor Kemp who signed it, is that they feel some of the policies, particularly around absentee voting, have the potential to be sources of fraud in voting. And so that some of the specific changes, they would argue that they have protected election integrity in the way that they've changed some of the policies. I also think they would say, and they did say this in the legislative session when they passed it, that there was a crisis of confidence among voters in the integrity of Georgia's election system. And that, for them, was a reason to pass this bill, even when they're confronted by Democrats, by outside experts, with the reality that there is no evidence of widespread voter fraud to the degree that would overturn elections. And that the reason that a significant portion of the Georgia electorate has lost confidence in the integrity of Georgia's elections is largely because Republican officials, not including Governor Kemp and Secretary of State Raffensperger, but other leading Republicans and President Trump, have told them that the election system in Georgia lacks integrity, and that because it lacks integrity, it allowed the Democrats to steal the election from President Trump for Joe Biden. Now, excuse me, I am particularly troubled by all of that, and I think very little of that analysis is, frankly, is reflective of reality. There are not instances of widespread voter fraud, not in Georgia, not in any other place. I have, in some ways, found it almost amusing that in the few narrow instances of people voting twice that have been uncovered, one of which I saw was reported in Nevada this week, that those people voted for President Trump. And that, I guess, something that may have been internalized by some of these more conspiratorial-minded voters is that, if the Democrats are committing all of this fraud, then maybe I do need to vote twice by requesting an absentee ballot for my recently deceased wife and voting for her, voting on her behalf, even though she has passed, which is the context of this case in Nevada that I saw this week. I think my analysis sort of falls into two buckets about what the impact of this bill would be and what it means more broadly for our politics. The first is I do think, on balance, you can pull out every provision of Senate Bill 202, and there are some that make it easier to vote. One in particular is the increased number of early voting days in counties that previously didn't allow I believe it was the maximum legally allowed. And so in some of those counties, which typically are not the metro Atlanta counties, but are the more sparsely populated counties, there will be additional opportunities to early vote in those counties. But then others governing ID requirements for absentee ballots and some of the other policies that just govern the way people vote, I think do make it marginally more difficult to vote. What the actual electoral impact of those policies will be, I think, is up in the air because, certainly, if you did a really close analysis, if you could follow every voter in this state, you probably will find, at minimum, a handful of voters who were not able to comply with new requirements because they didn't know about them or because they didn't have the time or the ability to address new requirements like getting an ID or being able to make it to their polling place or any of the logistical challenges. At the same time, this has continued to focus on the message that comes from Democrats to a lot of their own voters that the intent behind this bill is to take away your right to vote. And that's a galvanizing, it's a motivating force for a lot of people. And it's also continued reason for all of these organizations that do voter contact, for them to continue to raise money to gather resources and to redouble their efforts to combat what they describe as voter suppression. So I think the sort of on balance, how's it going to play out, I think is still a little bit TBD. But I think the more dangerous part of the legislation is that even though Governor Kemp, Secretary of State Raffensperger, even though they sort of stood in the breach in the 2020 election and said, no, we cannot just overturn an election because you think there's fraud, the act of passing this bill, continuing focus on this issue, I think plays into the sort of fertile ground for misinformation, for losing confidence in our democracy among the most Trump-aligned voters in the Republican Party, and to the extent that then people, and here in particular I'm thinking about Jody Hice running for Secretary of State, but to the extent that people then in the future run for office, tap into those feelings of voters and organize campaigns around ongoing problems with voter fraud or what you believe to be voter fraud, I think it institutionalizes some of that skepticism of our democracy in some of the positions that are designed to protect the integrity of the democracy. And that, I think, is a bad long-term trend that I think really needs to more seriously be grappled with. And so the elements of Senate Bill 202 in particular that give more opportunities for elections officials that are supposed to be nonpartisan people to overturn elections or to raise questions about the integrity of elections, that those provisions in particular are potentially the most dangerous provisions given the fertile ground that they will land on in future elections. If you then have people in those positions who have made political careers out of playing into this misinformation. And I find it really alarming.
Well, this is a much rougher transition than I would like, but looking ahead at the elections, we've talked about the Senate race and partially the governor's race, but Stacey Abrams appears to be on a glide path for the nomination if she so chooses. Do you think she will run? And if she doesn't, who do the Democrats have to run a marquee race against Governor Brian Kemp?
To me, the most important piece of information that suggests that Stacey Abrams will run is that other high-profile, up-and-coming Democratic figures have already announced bids for other statewide offices. State Representative Bee Nguyen running for Secretary of State, State Senator Jen Jordan running for Attorney General. State Representative Eric Allen running for lieutenant governor, and there's more people on that list that I'm probably forgetting, but if there was some sense that Stacey Abrams would not run, I think some of these people would have held back in declaring for their own contests. And I find it very unlikely that Stacey Abrams, given the work that she's put in to this state since 2014, would get all the way up to qualifying for the 2022 race and then just be like, I don't want to do it. And just sort of like leave Democrats in the lurch about how to actually deal with that. So I think it's very likely that she runs. And I've forgotten the second half of your question.
Well, no. That was the question, which is, since you don't think she would take a pass, who the Democrats had to fill that slot. You've already mentioned some of those names: Jen Jordan, a B. Wynn, Matthew Wilson, somebody like that who could, or Eric Allen. So you heard it here. Kyle Hayes says, no Mario Cuomo playing on the tarmac moment. I'm betraying my age. That's a 1992 reference to Mario Cuomo. So lastly, since you're a policy guy, let's finish on a policy question. What policies are the Democrats and the Republicans, because very much these are unified tickets anymore, top to bottom. What policies are the Republican Party of Georgia going to run on, and what policies are the Democrats going to run on, and possibly what policies would you like to see them run on?
So to start with the Republicans, I do think that there is still some legitimate push or pull in a policy space about what the Republican Party wants to stand for. The most outspoken, politically engaged members of the grassroots base right now, I think, are largely ready to organize themselves around a policy agenda that addresses all of the identity issues that they have, been activated on over the last couple of election cycles. So you've seen this push around, particularly at local school board meetings, targeting the teaching of critical race theory, or what they call critical race theory, really attacking the teaching of anything to do with race in classrooms at all. And I think you could see that energy institutionalized, at least for that part of the Republican Party, in statewide bans on critical race theory, or more opportunities, more legal avenues for the state to intervene in what is being taught in classrooms, more opportunities to intervene in the operations of local school boards. And then I think it does sort of reignite, it opens up an opportunity for the Republicans who, in a much more quiet way, have pushed for additional school choice options. This is another reason for them to say, let's give parents an opportunity to send their children to schools that are aligned with their own beliefs. I think if you're Governor Kemp, I don't think you really want to run on those issues. I don't think you really want to run on continued skepticism of Georgia's elections. And so I think that you could see him attempt to turn back to some of the less polarizing and more popular issues that he's campaigned on, whether it's, whether he has the opportunity to complete his teacher pay raise proposal that he ran on in 2018, whether he can do it before the election or would try to do it after the election. Economic development, that as much as I've criticized Governor Kemp for his focus, if you're Governor Kemp's staff listening to this, you might say, well, we're doing a lot of the things that Governor Deal did, highlighting jobs announcements, pursuing aggressively economic development opportunities. And I think that, given his more perilous political positioning, it would behoove him to bring some focus back to those kinds of issues where there's much more consensus in the state of Georgia on those issues. So I think that's the Republicans. I think on the Democrats' part, the issues that they've been running on, fully funding the state's education system, Medicaid expansion, all of those things are still on the table. I think in some ways because those issues have been on the table and Democrats have been on the more popular side of those issues, but they have struggled, at least in state races, to win by highlighting those issues. I'm interested to see sort of like what a more comprehensive vision of democratic governance in Georgia looks like. In 2014, you probably thought it would have been basically business as usual, but we do expand Medicaid, we do fully fund the education system, and maybe you find some like tax revenue or something.
Yeah, higher ed spending, good.
Yeah.
Something of a return to the Barnes Miller.
Yeah, and I'm interested to see if there's sort of a more comprehensive vision available for Democrats. But I think it comes back to the challenge again. Like I'm a policy guy. We've organized so much of our podcast around policy discussions and how it relates with politics. But the trend that I've observed, the longer that I'm a part of this, is that in so many of these elections, policy does not matter. It does not turn votes. And
if white papers were votes, Elizabeth Warren would be president.
that is true.
Or Hillary Clinton, for that matter, I suppose.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, Kyle, is there anything else you'd like to record for posterity? Not that you couldn't do it on your own podcast, but anything you'd like to record for your oral history?
No, I think I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I feel particularly lucky just in terms of this period of history to be a part of in Georgia politics, to be engaged in, because I think we really are one of the more interesting states in all of the country in how our politics is evolving. So,
we certainly live in interesting times for good and bad.
Yeah.
So,
yes.
So Kyle, thank you again on behalf of the Richard B. Russell Library for Political Research and Studies. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.